Okay, everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Jorge Nagem. I teach Latin American history here at the University of Manitoba. And this is a panel that I see has been labeled simply Guatemala. So you know what you're getting, it's Guatemala. Okay. So we have three presentations here, so we're going to stick to 20 minutes for each presentation, around that. And then I'll give some comments and we'll open for discussion. So we're going to begin with Jim Handy from the Department of History at the University of Saskatchewan, who is going to present on Invigorating Revolutionary Change, some observations from Guatemala.
Okay, no I won't. The title of my talk has changed a little bit from in the program. It's now called An Easy Instrument in the Hands of Unscrupulous Men. That's a quote, peasants, Maya and otherwise, in pursuit of the Guatemala Revolution. Before I start, I went to see Amy Goodman last night. Anybody else see her? Besides Annette, who was with me. It was a great talk. One of the discussions, one of the central points she had was that to come to an understanding of anything, we need fully to listen to people's stories. And so this seems to me, in a limited way, kind of what I'm suggesting in the broader work from which this paper is drawn. So it's, give you the title. What is a revolution? The Oxford Dictionary provides one definition: a forcible overthrow of a government, social order, in favor of a new system. It's interesting, though, that the roots to that, the Latin roots to revolution, are to roll back, suggesting there is some element of a revolution that connotes a return. It is perhaps this lingering tension between revolution as a dramatic embrace of the new and its links to a return to a remembered or imagined past that makes the history of revolutions, I think, so compelling and so complex. This is certainly the case, I think, in exploring the relationship between peasants and revolutionary change. A long trail of revolutionary leaders and intellectuals have minimized the revolutionary potential of peasants. It's argued that they need to be led and their energies directed by non-peasant activists, else they too easily revert towards reinventing a past in the future. Academics studying revolution, I think, have fallen into the same pattern, too quick to dismiss peasant revolutionary initiatives and too ready to paint any appeal to long-held concepts of justice as a retreat to tradition rather than a march towards revolution. Peasants, Maya and otherwise, in the Guatemalan Revolution from 1944 to 1954, have suffered a similar academic interment. Believed not to have embraced revolutionary change wholeheartedly, to have had little part in advancing the Guatemalan Revolution's ideals, and certainly not to have anything to do in crafting its intellectual and ideological currents. Indeed, in some accounts, it is primarily because peasants, particularly Mayan peasants, were unprepared to defend the revolution that the revolution was overthrown. In the best academic language, let me say, this is all poppycock. So, let me begin. I probably don't need to provide too detailed a background to the revolution to this audience. You probably all have some familiarity with it. Very briefly, in 1944, primarily urban demonstrations prompted the long-reigning dictator Jorge Ubico to resign. His dictator-in-waiting successor was sort of overthrown with long, violent struggle, primarily, again, urban. Once successful, these young reformers crafted a constitution, held an election. The first government of the revolution, that led by Juan José Arevalo, was succeeded in 1951 by the second government of the revolution, second president of the revolution, Jacobo Arbenz. And Jacobo Arbenz was forced to resign in June of 1954, facing opposition from the Guatemalan military, from the United States State Department, CIA and their surrogates, a Catholic Church in opposition, and an increasingly antagonistic urban middle class. With Arbenz's revolution in 1954, resignation in 1954, the revolution ended. It's the Guatemalan Revolution in 2 minutes. I want to delve into the rural aspects of the Guatemalan Revolution and the relationship between peasants and the Guatemalan Revolution. I skipped that page. The record of the first administration of the revolution, that is Juan Jose Arevalo from 1945 to 1951, is decidedly mixed when it comes to things rural. The new constitution passed before he came to office effectively eliminated the vagrancy law, which had forced most Mayan peasants to work in coffee fincas and elsewhere for the last decade. The Constitution also guaranteed the right of laborers to organize for social and economic needs. This guarantee was quickly rescinded after Arevalo came to power. While technically legal to do so, rural workers were prevented from organizing through violence and the opposition of the military. In 1947, the government passed a new labor code that prevented labor organization in rural areas, except for in those very few locations where more than 500 people were employed. This was a restriction not relaxed until after the death of the chief of the Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Arana, in 1949. Even then, strikes during the harvest were illegal. Very little was done to meet the most pressing need of peasants, that is, to get them land. A law of forced rental was passed in 1949 and revisions approved in 1951, but little else was done. Indeed, what most marked this administration, the first administration of the revolution, was a fairly violent and forceful repression of most peasant and rural labor organizations. The revolution took power in the midst of a horrifically violent expression of Guatemala's racial divide. This racial divide was also to some extent the divide between rural and urban, peasant and others. In 1944, a dozen or so Cachiquel Mayan men, attacked the Ladinos living in the town center of Patsasilla, killing many of them. Ladinos are, for our purposes, non-Maya. It's somewhat more complicated than that. Fear of the Mayan revolt, around Mayan revolt, was the terror that underscored the constant tension in Guatemalan society. A psychosis that grew the more Guatemalan economy relied on the abused bodies of Mayan laborers to produce Guatemala's wealth. It was a terror shared by middle-class Ladinos in big urban centers, but it was felt most strongly by Ladinos resident in smaller towns throughout the country. The reaction to Patsasilla, to this killing of the Ladinos in the center of the town, was an explosion of this long simmering psychotic terror, a brutal, overwhelming, violent response as Ladinos from all over the region, from La Antigua to Solola, from San Martino, Lotepeque to Guatemala City, flooded into Patsasilla to teach Maya that there was going to be no relaxing in the vigilance that had ensured their place in Guatemalan society for the last 100 years or so. The yet uncounted hundreds of dead in Patsasilla haunted Guatemala's memory throughout the revolution. With Patsasilla as a reminder, early struggles of rural laborers and peasants were fraught with tension and met by an exaggerated response. Still, with the overthrow of the dictatorship and with the vague promises of the revolution ringing in their ears, peasants and rural laborers, Mayan and otherwise, organized and protested in virtually all parts of the country. By 1945-1946, from Rabanal in the Oriente to San Marcos in the Pacific Piedmont, mostly Mayan peasants and rural workers struggled to take back, protested working conditions, organized to win municipal elections, struggled to take control of municipal land, and despite attempts to force them to do so, refused to work on the coffee harvest without increased wages and better working conditions. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, despite a flood of reports that describe the eager embrace of the revolutionary strategies by peasants, Mayan and otherwise, the dominant response from observers all over the country and from many academics who have written about the revolution since was that somehow these peasants were led to these protests, that they would not and could not on their own accord have led to these struggles and opposition. Perhaps a report from a resident of the town of Rabanal is most illustrative. Concerned with increasing demands of the Pokemon Maya majority peasants for land, this informant informed the major newspaper in the city, in the country, that the peasants were, and I quote, being rounded up like cattle in dense groups in diverse sites of the town, waiting to pounce. This is a remarkable phrase. Like cattle, waiting to pounce. Suggests much about the perception of Maya peasants during the early days of the revolution. Stoic, placid, but somehow dangerous and prone to violence. But what's most interesting for us here might be the beginning of the phrase. They were not congregating or gathering, they were being rounded up. And the reference to cattle here is pretty useful as well. They were being organized and driven by, they argued, to violence by unseen and hidden faces. People, conservatives and the more timid of the revolutionary forces as well, soon thought they had found names to put behind these hidden faces, radical organizers, unscrupulous men, or communists. Although in Guatemala in the middle of the 20th century, that was a distinction without difference. By definition, all communists were unscrupulous men. Those attempts to turn the rhetoric of the that these people were behind the revolutionary uprisings. Responding to these reports, the president posted most of them out of the country on diplomatic postings. Repression in a silk glove, as the one newspaper described it. It made little difference. Despite violent repression, rural workers struck the coffee harvest in 1946 and 47, and again in 1947 and 1948. When they couldn't make owners meet their demands, they simply walked away from the harvest. The military responded with excessive force, declaring that its mandate required it to keep the country within a margin of tranquility and that it was required to act whenever national principles are menaced. The Guatemalan Growers Associations, the AGA, blamed the strikes on the pernicious action of demagogic agitators. A closer look at this period suggests something else very different was at play. The most radical and most powerful of the rural workers associations, the CTG, had agreed reluctantly to the restrictions on rural organizing and had agreed not to organize strikes. The CTG organizers and activists who were most often blamed for such radical activities all reported time and again that they could not control the rural associations of their union, that they could only counsel patients so often before they were simply ignored. Through such activity, rural workers were able to push for better working conditions and increased wages, first on government-controlled national fincas, and then spreading throughout the large private coffee fincas. By 4 years into the revolution, daily wages on coffee fincas during the harvest had increased from 10 to 15 cents a day to 80 cents a day. Rather than being easy instruments in the hands of unscrupulous men, as was declared, rural workers were at the forefront of these struggles, pushing the agenda of the revolution, forcing the revolution to address their issues, and to confront the most intractable problems of Guatemalan society. CTG organizers trailed long behind, reining in their members only with the most difficulty. I'm going to have to go quicker in the next round. Okay. The presidency of Jacobo Arbenz in the second administration of the revolution was much more sympathetic to the concerns of rural workers and peasants. He led an administration determined to foster real change. Still, despite the arguments of people at the time and the writings of academics echoing those arguments, The evidence makes it clear that peasants and rural workers drove the revolutionary agenda of the Arbenz administration, the second administration of the revolution as well. Arbenz had promised changes to land tenure in each one of his major speeches during the election campaign in 1950. During the next 2 years after his election, at every opportunity, thousands of peasants and workers gathered at every public address to boisterously and often angrily demand that Arbenz live up to those promises. While there's no indication that Arbenz was not prepared to do so, it is also clear that Arbenz needed to do this to maintain the support of peasants and rural workers, and so passed the famous Agrarian Reform Law in June of 1952. Those groups, that is, peasants and rural workers, were rapidly organizing in grassroots revolt against this indispensable discipline that had trapped them for 5 decades of coffee violence. After the killing of the Army Chief of Staff in 1949, Rural Workers Union, now the CGT, ballooned in size and influence. When an offshoot of that union decided that they needed a separate peasant league, and so formed the CNCG. The CNCG expanded dramatically. It's really interesting to see the way that discussions of the CNCG, the Peasant League, has occurred in the literature. Most academics have dismissed it as a kind of hollow shell, a national organization without adherents in rural areas, and especially without adherents among Mayan peasants. Its stunted growth, an important element in the failure of the revolution. How strange. One wonders what they're reading. Given its first national conference in 1951, by the end of 1952, there were 1,600 unions in the Peasant League. By 1954, 2,500 unions in the Peasant League. There was an active peasant union league in virtually every municipio in Guatemala. In many, there was a separate union in distinct aldeas within each municipio. The Peasant League, by a year after the passage of the Agrarian Reform Law, the Peasant League was clearly the largest organization in the country, and it was rapidly becoming the most powerful. Because you haven't given me the 5-minute sign, does that mean I get extra time?
No, you have 3 minutes. You have 3 minutes now.
The agrarian reform passed by the Arbenz administration was the key piece in the revolution, the single most important legislative initiative in the decade. But it was on paper surprisingly moderate. It just took a little bit of the land from the largest estates if they weren't using their land effectively. For all sorts of measures for landowners to appeal. What made that law revolutionary was the spur it provided to peasants and rural worker organizations. Land was expropriated following the denunciation of the land by organized peasants. Organized peasants and rural workers in each community were heavily represented in the local agrarian committees, which decided what land was going to be taken and, to a certain extent, who got that land. Given the opportunity to get land, and despite often violent opposition from landowners and their agents, peasants almost immediately organized at the local level. They almost immediately denounced land. By August of 1952, June 1952, the law was passed. By August of 1952, the agrarian committees had received 5,000 denunciations of land. That is, claims of land in particular places. Very often, the paragraphs of an agrarian reform bill were less important in local organizing than a history of local oppression or a sense of what was just. Peasant leagues and local agrarian committees used these organizations to redress local wrongs often, rather than adhering rigidly to the law. So local tavern keepers, for instance, who had been able to accumulate land because of people's addictions or misfortunes, had land taken from them. Virtually every denunciation of land, more often than not, included long accounts of historical claims to land that had been taken from the community in the first blush of the expansion of coffee 5 decades earlier. Similarly, local landowners who had good relations to workers and mozos and colonels very often were treated better locally by the landowners. By the peasants. Less than a year after the passage of the Agrarian Reform, President Barbence remarked that the Agrarian Reform had, and I quote, drawn the classic line in the sand. There is no family, there is no person in our country who has not been affected by the Agrarian Reform. And let me skip a discussion about bureaucracy. Let me finish up. In the postmortems of the Guatemalan Revolution, after Arbenz was forced to resign in June of 1954, very few people talk about peasants and their role in the revolution. Those few who talk about the countryside, those academics who wrote about the countryside, would occasionally argue that Arbenz's administration was doomed because peasants, especially Mayan peasants, were either opposed to the revolution or not sympathetic enough to come to its defense. Again, one wonders what sources they consulted, whose stories they listened to. When the invasion of the Liberación crossed the border from Honduras, they were fought to a standstill and beaten back by a local peasant league. Peasant leagues all over the country announced they were willing to stand by the revolution. They were told to wait until the military gave them orders. The orders never came. Peasants in Guatemala during the 10 years from 1944 to 1954 drove the revolutionary agenda. They withstood violence and intimidation and disinterest to ensure that the revolution paid attention to their concerns. They demanded land stolen from them in the past be returned to them. They demanded that land be used effectively, to give to them so that land could be used more effectively. They argued that land had a social function and needed to be shared more equitably. They withstood violence and intimidation. They drew the line in the sand. They made the revolution. Sorry?
Thank you. Okay, so now we are going to listen to Julie Gibbings. She's at the History Department here at the University of Manitoba. I don't know if you have the same title now, or you change it. So okay, I will tell the title here. That is listed in quotations. Now, owners of our land, end of quotation. The affective politics of Guatemala's agrarian reform in Alta, Verapaz. Julie.
So what I wanted to do is think a little bit about how the agrarian reform had much earlier origins. The 1952 agrarian reform in the nationalization of German properties in this region that I study, which is a northwestern region called Alta Verapaz, and was one of the principal German strongholds in the region, and to then just show how basically that experience of German National Socialism and then World War II and the nationalization of German properties set the conditions for expectations for agrarian reform from below. But how this is completely complicated because any image of Germans has to account for the fact that they were deeply embedded in Guatemalan society in terms of their social relations with the Maya, especially the Kekchi Maya people of that place. So historians have largely examined Guatemala's agrarian reform in 1952 in isolation from World War II and the nationalization of properties that occurred in 1944 to 45. Yet according to some figures, 365,000 acres of the total 920,000 acres redistributed were the nationalized property of German Guatemalans And most of the remaining land, in fact, belonged to the United Fruit Company. And so only, according to these figures, which may not be exactly correct, but Jim and I can talk about that later, only 3.9% of locally owned private land was affected. In Alta Verapaz, which was known as Guatemala's Little Germany, the revolutionary period and the 1952 agrarian reform was profoundly shaped by the political upheavals of World War II, which ruptured German power and heightened already existing demands for the redistribution of German-owned properties. Indeed, what I see in the 1930s is a burgeoning anti-German and anti-foreign economic nationalism that emerges in Alta Verapaz in newspaper editorials and municipal petitions, as well as coming from municipal governments' calls to the dictator of the time, the Jorge Obico, to redistribute, to nationalize and redistribute German properties to the hands of Guatemalans. In addition, they take up this really fantastic anti-imperialist image of the region as Tetzutlan, which is in Nahua, the land of war, and was the name given to the region by Pedro Alvarado during this moment of great resistance. So they take up this also historic image of the region as Tetzutlan, which is, anyway, again in a kind of an anti-imperialist fashion. And when Jorge Obico was eventually ousted in June of 1944, what also happened was that a general from Alta Verapaz, General Federico Ponce Baires, comes into power temporarily. And he puts this Ladino economic nationalist vision into practice. And so on August 14th, this is 2 months before the October Revolution, he nationalized German properties and assets. And not because, or principally anyway, because of a Nazi threat, but rather because he argued or made the economic argument that these lands were of public utility to the Guatemalan people. The next day, Alta Verapaz's conservative regional newspaper, Norte, headlined, "Long live Guatemala, now owners of its land," hence the title of the paper. Declaring that a new era was being ushered in, the editorialist J.J. Palma celebrated the time as it had arrived to recuperate their heirlooms of their ancestors. National newspapers were also filled with headlines and across the spectrum of national newspapers that read such things as nationalization of Nazi properties, Guatemala ceases to be an economic slave, and Guatemala for Guatemalans. By September 1st, the Congress had even agreed that property should be distributed among workers and the land poor. Such exuberance reflected the feeling that something akin to Mexico's 1938 nationalization of oil was finally reaching Guatemalan soil. And suddenly Guatemalan properties producing nearly 400,000 quintales of coffee, a lot, were in the hands of the newly created Department of Nationalized Plantations. 2 months later, the October Revolution swept the nation. And people from Alta Verapaz, Alta Verapancenses at least, expected the revolution would continue what Ponce had started. In Alta Verapaz, however, the World War II and the expropriation of German properties also had preceded the internment of German citizens and resulted not only in expectations that German properties would be distributed to the laborers who worked them, but it profoundly unsettled social relations among German settlers, their mixed-race children, and their Guatemalan concubines or wives. It is common to hear in Alta Verapaz today that it was the disinherited sons of German Guatemalan coffee planters who then petitioned for land shortly after their fathers returned from internment in the U.S. The German men began returning between about 1946 to 47, 48. It is common to hear that it was the, By examining a combination of oral histories and archival sources, this paper analyzes the affective politics from nationalist anti-German sentiments to the betrayals experienced by the Guatemalan children of Germans interned during the war. The tendency among scholars to either elide or to downplay the German question during Guatemala's revolutionary spring, I think is part and parcel of what I've called elsewhere the myth of diasporic social and political insularity, the prevailing notion that German settlers largely kept to themselves and remained socially and politically isolated from both Guatemalans and the march of Guatemalan history. So just to give you a brief sort of background, beginning in like the 1860s, German immigrants, principally from the trading centers of Hamburg and Bremen, settled in Alta Verapaz in relatively small numbers with dreams of prosperity brought by coffee exports, German imports, and finance. By the 1920s, out of the total 328 plantations in the region, 108 were owned by Germans, 135 by Ladinos, who are non-Mayas, sort of, and 45 by Mayas. Generally, the other kind of important note in this is that the way that Alta Verapaz developed was slightly different than some other regions, and it was characterized not by migration from highlands to coffee plantations, and as in other regions, migration of laborers, but that they developed what were called fincas de mozas, which were plantations in which there was a resident labor force that exchanged its labor for a subsistence plot. By the 1920s, Germans also controlled moreover about 80% of all coffee exports. And the Great Depression in the 1930s recuperation hastened the further concentration of properties, financing, processing, and export in the hands of a small number of Germans. Even as the post-World War I context witnessed the rapid expansion of the German diaspora itself as more Germans came over, and a diversification of that German diaspora. So like other 19th century settlers who migrated into largely indigenous frontier regions, Germans in Alta Verapaz had relied upon concubinage to facilitate permanent settlement. In Alta Verapaz, the Kekchi daughters of wealthy landowning families afforded German immigrants the means to acclimatize quickly. They provided local medical knowledge, cultural knowledge, access to land, way to learn the language, etc. And these women generally worked both as domestic servants as well as sexual servants. So there was a real blurring of a line between, concubinage as well as like other practices of having a domestic servant. There were also German plantations owners that had less long-term relationships with women that was more or less plantation rape, something that you think of slave plantations, for example. So for example, one German argued, there is no sin once you are up in the mountains, when he was referring obviously to Kekchi sexual unions. And it coincided with Guatemalan elites' desire to racially whiten their nation via the importation of Germans. As one German coffee planter explained, the only solution for Guatemala is to improve the race, to bring the Aryan seed to improve it. On my plantation, I had a German administrator for many years, and for every Indian he got pregnant, I would pay him an extra $50. By the 1930s, these affective relations had led to the rise of a self-identified class of Kekchi Germans, the sons and daughters of German planters, and their Kekchi concubines, these longer-term relationships. These Kekchi Germans, however, were caught between competing nationalist tendencies, and intimate politics became highly politicized. The economic crisis of the 1930s had brought Jorge Ubico to power. He was a strong-arm populist dictator, an admirer of fascist regimes in Europe. And during his regime, he particularly linked the familial order and health of the nation, along with eugenics policy, with his own law and order regime. And same time, he's like lavishing praise upon German coffee planters and he has these desires to racially whiten the nation, all of which translate into a bolstering and a support of Kekchi Germans in Alta Verapaz. At the same time, of course, Nazism is also beginning to spread through long-established networks of German associational life, things like the German Club. So after Hitler's rise to power, Nazi Party officials marched into a meeting with the board of directors of Alta Verapaz's German club, the oldest in Central America, to demand control as true representatives of the new nation. As Oda Droeger, the wife of a coffee planter named Hugo Droeger, recalled, the German club became National Socialist, as well as the club in Guatemala City. Some hid the party's insignia underneath the flap of their bag, while others wore it with great joy. There were the armbands with the swastika, all of it. So even though the Nazi promise of a unified ethno-national community drew upon deep ties fostered by German associational life in the region, support for Nazis was not uniform, just as the German community was not unified politically or socially. Nonetheless, it did take somewhat of hold, even though only something like 10% of Germans in Alta Verapaz were actually members of the Nazi Party. What this led to was also an increasing pressure for Germans to return to Germany, both because they had newfound wealth and both because of the racial ideologies at the time and the nationalism, to find a proper German wife. It was no longer sufficient to have a Kekchi concubine. And this created this situation, or increasingly created this situation of two families, one German and one Kekchi German. And obviously, hierarchies among these different unions. As early as 1936, this potent combination of populist Guatemalan dictatorship and German National Socialism deeply politicized affective relations between German coffee planters and their Kekchi concubines, and the often intimate betrayals experienced by Kekchi German children and their mothers. In 1936, for example, Fidelia Bohl from the village of Chaquiton wrote to the departmental governor requesting his support. She wrote, I am a single woman and I live in great poverty for the following reasons. 16 years ago, as a domestic servant in the plantation of Sorcayu, and since Don Oscar Flor had the need for love, I accepted his propositions, procreating with him 4 children. Fidelia went on to explain that after 12 years of marital living, Flor had abandoned her for a German wife. It is a custom, she explained to the departmental governor, that the majority of the German men resident in our country take advantage not only of our personal labor, but also satiate their appetites with us. Afterwards, they leave their children abandoned, increasing the bitterness of the Republic's needy citizens as they flee very smugly and satisfied to enjoy the capital they have amassed with our sweat in Europe. In this we can see the scorn with which they view our poor nation and its inhabitants. Most surprising was Federico Karl Stalling, a Kekchi German, signed the petition and likely penned it on behalf of Fidelia as her legal representative. Through such petitions and many others like it that swamped the departmental governor's office, Kekchi elites and Kekchi Germans contested the idea that Germans were inaugurating a new desirable era of modernity. Absent and negligent German fathers were evidence that the desire for the accumulation of wealth, combined with excessive individualism, led not to national progress, but to impoverished children and exploited others. As the narrative-driven abandonment gained force, it not only elicited images of children economically impoverished, morally neglected, and politically dangerous, but the narrative also acted as a metaphor for the exploitation of entire nation at the hands of the Allied forces. Despite the weaker support for the German community in Guatemala and his admiration of fascist regimes in Europe, the President was both aware of growing support in Guatemala for the Allied forces and the strategic importance of his ties with the United States. Responding to both domestic and U.S. diplomatic pressure in 1941, he published first a proclaimed list that listed German properties and businesses. Then 6 months later, after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, he declared war on Germany, and then limited constitutional decrees. Oh my God, I had to speed things up. Sorry, guys. So basically, Germans were deported en masse to the United States, but more than half of the local Nazis were left behind, and those deported ranged from flag-waving patriots for a German victory in war to apolitical planters to Jewish refugees, social democrats, and other opponents of Hitler's regime. So it had very little to do with actual Nazi affiliation. In Alta Verapaz, the internment of Germans and the expropriation of German properties ruptured tensions within German Guatemalan families. Only days after, Dorotea Winter taught, a Quechua German and the concubine of the German Hugo Drüger, discovered that the family plantation San Vicente appeared on the proclaimed list. And she wrote to President Abico directly. In her letter, she reinterpreted her years as Hugo's concubine as one of unpaid service, a domestic servant, and demanded payment for services and recognition of the rights of her children as Guatemalans. Shortly afterwards, Hugo Drüger was taken to a camp in the United States, and with these properties expropriated and him gone, conflicts arose between Dorotea and Hugo's German wife, proper German wife, Oda. For middle-class Latinos, Quechua students, and teachers in Alta Verapaz, the internment of German citizens and their properties precipitated the dawn of a new era of democracy and hope. On July 1st, 1944, popular movement overthrew Abico. They were inspired by the Atlantic Charter, of course, and then when Ponce Bailes comes to power, things really rupture that August. And the region of Alta Verapaz itself erupted in debates about what should be done with nationalized plantations after he fully nationalizes them in 1944. Maya leaders like Jose Angelico rallied peasants into organizations and political parties on the promise not only of the end vagrancy laws, but also, more importantly, that German properties would be redistributed. The nationalization of German properties, for as much as it sent an ominous warning, rallied middle classes and peasants, also sent an ominous warning to Guatemalan elites. If the Guatemalan government could compensate and redistribute German properties, it could, of course, obviously do the same with Guatemalan ones. By the time the October Revolution swept the nation, the government controlled 130 plantations confiscated from the German community. And even still, immediately after the revolution in 1945, state officials continued to try to expand the number by attempting to, for example, confiscate plantations of the German-born concubines, or the Guatemalan-born concubines and children of Germans. So like the plantation owned by Dorotea Wintertot. As well as others, as early as 1946, began to petition the government for the redistribution of land, and as well as parties also. Beginning in 1947, things began to get more complicated because that is when German citizens also began to return to Guatemala. The United States, where most Germans were interned, made it clear that it did not, in fact, want Germans to return to Guatemala. As historian Max Paul Friedman has argued, the program of internment had shifted course during the war from an undertaking primarily motivated by the need to ensure security against subversion into a long-term project of permanently weakening German economic competition in a region long claimed as America's backyard. So U.S. officials were determined not to let Germans back to Guatemala, and Guatemala, while willing to accept Germans, had no intention of returning the properties or their assets. In 1947, the nationalized plantation, Chimax, for example, was divided. One section was given up to make into a sports stadium, and the other was divided into small plots for the town's rural proletariat. The local newspapers applauded these efforts, and local citizens wrote to the municipality in favor of the redistribution. Others, including Quechua Germans, petitioned for the redistribution of properties. Indeed, the return of German Guatemalans hastened conflicts within and between German Quechuas and their German families. Some Quechua German children were among, the most radical advocates of distributing German property. For example, Jesus Pecai Turkheim, who was the father of, or the son, whose father, Juan von Turkheim, lost his highly indebted plantations in the first decades of the 20th century, became a radical advocate of Kekchi laborers and a perennial troublemaker. And so in 1947, he led a strike in Chama demanding that the government grant them ownership of the nationalized plantations they occupied. So it was only really 3 years later that the Guatemalan government passed the famous Decree 900, instituting a market-based and very, moderate agrarian reform. Alta Verapancenses, however, had been thinking about the redistribution of German properties to the land and land to the poor working classes for some time. And so it is common to hear that it is the disinherited and unrecognized sons of German planters who organized to take their father's land. And national plantations did award a significant amounts of land, principally to resident laborers, many of whom likely would have been the unrecognized sons of German planters. Hugo Droiger, for example, the German planter who owned San Vicente, was famous for having fathered hundreds of laborers in the belief that the children he produced with his laborers were not only racially improved and better workers, but more loyal ones as well. When the peasants first made labor demands and then petitioned for land on San Vicente, they so enraged the brothers of Dorotea Winter-Tot, especially one named Carlos Winter-Tot, that he enacted revenge. Hugo Droiger even sought to bargain with the workers, offering them better wages if they helped to get his nationalized plantation back. When all of that failed, on a Sunday afternoon, only 4 days before the workers of San Vicente were awarded the land, Carlos Winter-Tot, the brother of Dorotea, shot the principal Maya peasant leader of that plantation, Santiago Sikul Maku, in the back, in front of his family. 4 days later, San Vicente was awarded to some 277 laborers who resided on that plantation. In the jurisdiction of Alta Verapaz, the two largest municipalities of that jurisdiction, 11 nationalized plantations were distributed among 1,015 resident laborers. And so if the United Fruit Companies are excluded, more land was redistributed in the Department of Alta Verapaz than any other department in Guatemala. In Alta Verapaz, there were 74 expropriations, awarding a total of 152,000 and some manzanas of land. The next closest department of Escuintla was awarded 78,000 manzanas of land distributed across 105 expropriations. So more expropriations. So there were there were more land in fewer expropriations because there were larger plantations in Alta Verapaz. The expropriation records themselves only leave faint traces of the effective politics that shaped the reform, and sometimes contain petitions written by local organizers and so forth. But memories of the revolutionary period themselves are filled with intimate tales of sexual excess, betrayals, and revenge. Indeed, when the Liberation Army entered Guatemala on June 17, 1954, Hugo Droiger's recognized son, Gustavo, was among those who joined the resistance. While post-revolutionary governments reversed the agrarian reform, the same cannot be said for the German properties intervened during World War II. German properties were instead distributed as rewards to military officers and occasionally became cooperatives. As a result, for German Guatemalans and their mixed-race children, memories of Guatemala's revolution are like a closed box, locked away from familial conversations and public narratives. Instead, an emphasis is placed on the time before Guatemala entered the Second World War as a moment of interfamilial harmony, prosperity, and great optimism, in which Germans were leading Guatemalans towards modernity. The expropriations and nationalizations, like the disappointments and conflicts that followed them, signal a dramatic end to this era, when the Guatemalan nation had forsaken its loyal German settlers and brought this period of prosperity and progress to a sudden halt. For others, of course, Guatemala's revolution represents a period of social justice and great optimism for a prosperous future, and its end is a tragedy that unleashed 3.5 decades of state repression and fear. These dichotomous narratives of the revolution, however, suggest that effective politics is people-made nationalism and politics personal, where it's center stage not only in the aftermath, but also in the making of the revolution itself. Thank you. And
Okay, we are moving now to our last presenter, Patrick Chassé, right? A PhD candidate at the University of Saskatchewan's Department of History, and I'm not going to read the title because I think that you changed it, so go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So this is going to be after the revolution, so give us some context for the long term of the agrarian reform. And the title is Creating Authentic Human Beings, Citizenship and Development During Guatemala's Counter-Revolution. The success of Guatemala's 1952 agrarian reform terrified Guatemalan elites, feared the empowerment of Guatemala's long oppressed indigenous population. For centuries, landowners depended on the cheap, skilled labor of Guatemala's indigenous campesinos to pick coffee, cut cane, and collect bananas. Their labor was an essential part of Guatemala's famous fertility. By giving campesinos enough land to live on, the agrarian reform threatened to increase labor costs and reduce the profitability of export agriculture. It also upset an established social and racial hierarchy that benefited Guatemala's elite, tapping into long-held fears about an indigenous uprising. The revolution was cut short, as we've seen, by a coup in June of 1954. The self-styled liberation, or Liberación, regime that replaced the revolution was led by Castillo Armas, and one of their first acts was to reverse the agrarian reform. And they tried to create a landscape that was dominated by private capital. Landowners, the state, and large corporations like the United Fruit Company persecuted campesinos, workers, and labor organizers under the pretext that they were purging communists. A witness in Alta Verapaz recalled the overthrow of Arbenz as a dramatic transition between an age of liberty and oppression. Quote, "When Arbenz died," a reference to the coup, "the mayor called on us and told us that now we won't be working like before, that they don't listen to anybody. Here ended our work in the committees, and we began our work on the haciendas." Campesinos across the country abandoned their crops to save their lives, and this had an immediate consequence for food production. There were large crop losses as crops rotted in the fields, which had consequences for several years afterwards, with food shortages and speculation becoming the norm. This was after several years of bumper crops. After 1954, Guatemala's rural poor had fewer labor rights, less access to land, and they struggled to afford food. However, the new president Castillo Armas and his successor, Miguel Yedegores Fuentes, could not entirely ignore the revolution, even as they set about reversing many of its key initiatives. The social and economic policies introduced during Guatemala's very brief democratic moment improved the lives of many Guatemalans. And the military regimes that ruled Guatemala after the revolution tried to use, pervert, twist the rhetoric of agrarian reform in an effort to stem rural unrest caused by repression and escalating food prices. The government used the specific programs we're going to talk about in a few minutes, these carefully controlled agrarian development zones as ideal models for coastal colonization and agrarian reform. Now, as we'll see, these planned agrarian colonies resettled an insignificant fraction of Guatemala's campesino population. However, Castillo Armas and his successors spoke in the discourse of agrarian modernization, of improvement, about using new technologies to improve productivity. But their policies, especially their agrarian reform policies, only deepened structural inequalities. Without the regulations that had been introduced during the revolution to conserve natural resources, to support campesinos in their organizing activity, many of the agrarian reform initiatives and agrarian modernization initiatives after 1954 increased yields on large plantations at the expense of the poor and the environment. So as I was saying in the beginning, The reversal of Decree 900, which is the sort of technical name for the Agrarian Reform Law, displaced thousands of campesinos and created destabilizing food shortages throughout the country. And this was significantly worsened by a drought that followed the coup. In July 1955, the popular student newspaper El Estudiante argued that the Liberación had created a widespread food crisis by returning land to Guatemalan elites. They argued that the coup unleashed, quote, a politics of rancor and vengeance among landowners who, quote, systematically destroyed campesino crops with fire or fed them to animals, scant months before they could be harvested. El Estudiante's editors criticized Castillo Armas and his government for Guatemala's humiliating dependency on US food aid after the coup. Instead of enabling campesinos to produce their own food on Guatemala's fertile land, they argued that the government opened up food stalls that perpetuated dependency. As an example, they said campesinos arrived in the middle of the night to claim their place to try to get food from these food stalls. They waited in interminable lines, and once they got to the front of the line, they could only buy enough corn to last a day. These desperate Guatemalans, concluded El Estudiante, constituted a ghostly army of hunger. Large landowners had consolidated the control of labor and land after the coup, but for campesinos, the Liberación revoked political liberties and saddled them with chronic hunger. Now, of course, the Liberación government, tried to shift blame for growing rural crisis onto the previous administration of Jacobo Arbenz. In November of 1956, Jorge Arenales, the Minister of Economy and Labor, told US allies that hunger was in sight in July 1954. And he said this was the result of government meddling in the field of agriculture. Food crops were left uncared for, and there was a critical shortage of corn and beans, the indispensable staples of the mass population, end quote. Now, this is a powerful rhetorical claim that justified US interference in Guatemala, but of course it was not supported by any statistics. Guatemala actually reversed its dependency on maize imports during the revolution, and especially during the Agrarian Reform period, by giving land to peasants who made it productive. After the coup, US grant aid and corn shipments were needed to help the Guatemalan government stabilize the country to prevent widespread famine. However, the influx of cheap corn created significant long-term problems for food production in Guatemala that I would argue are still going on today. Selling excess corn at market prices harmed local producers, but storing the corn was a serious infrastructure problem that the Liberación government was unable to handle. So as people struggled with hunger, warehouses were humid and infested with pests that destroyed the corn that had been sent from the US. So in short, giving peasants land was a far more effective solution to hunger than selling them cheap maize. By 1956, the US State Department itself had to acknowledge that negligible increases in the living standards of rural or urban workers had fostered, quote, disillusionment in the Castillo Armas regime. If the government didn't take immediate action, they were concerned, that is to say the US State Department, that simmering resentment could explode into destabilizing violence. The Castillo Armas regime tried to sort of assuage growing anxiety and unrest about the cost of food by passing its own form of agrarian reform, Decree 559. This law appropriated the language and symbolism of Decree 900, of the original agrarian reform. It levied taxes on underutilized lands, and it created a legislative framework for expropriation of the land for, quote, public good. Yet where the Arbenz government believed that land was just one part of a package of social and economic reforms, Castillo Armas and his successors used land reform as a symbolic tool to diffuse public criticism. Unlike the 1952 Agrarian Reform Law, which empowered campesinos and encouraged them to organize, Decree 559 centralized the process of expropriation and the distribution of land to campesinos in one government agency, the Dirección General de Asuntos Agrarios, which I'll just refer to as the GGAA. And it was the main arbiter of land redistribution, and it focused much of its efforts on developing agrarian development zones. Now, I think the emphasis on development over reform was a minor but ultimately significant rhetorical shift that indicated the state's emphasis on technical oversight as a safeguard for preventing popular appropriation of any potential reform process. So we would not have another Decree 900. Where Decree 900 facilitated the transfer of land to self-organized communities who were brought closer in the process of denunciation and the occupation of new land, the Liberation government believed that young, devout families would be the bedrock for its new agrarian development initiatives. The 1956 Agrarian Statute stressed the importance of private land ownership as the only means to incentivize campesinos to, quote, care for the land, defend it, and make it productive. Conservatives argued that Decree 900 suppressed individual initiative by forcing campesinos to accept land in usufruct, which in a very simplistic definition is lifelong rental. And it undermined the stability of communities by diminishing the power of the church. They defended Decree 559 as a more controlled and deliberate attempt at land reform. And they hoped that campesinos who benefited would then turn and place their faith in the state. Decree 559 distributed land to individuals who were selected by the state. And this unequal relationship between generous benefactor, the state, and poor recipient, the campesino, was intended to discourage political agitation. The state also focused on recruiting Ladino families over indigenous families for its agrarian development zones. Indigenous farmers were considered unprepared for, quote, the modern techniques being taught. And since the colonies were intended to create the nucleus for a new middle class and strengthen Guatemalan democracy, it was considered irresponsible to give political and economic power to, quote, primitive Indians. Now, Decree 559 did little to deal with the systemic inequalities that caused food shortages that were ongoing through this period. It distributed very little land compared to Decree 900, and even the campesinos who did receive land were complaining that they were never receiving legal titles, which of course is one of the justifications for this new land reform, that they would have titles. Instead, Decree 559 diffused criticism while the government focused on more and better agricultural technology and incentivized large plantations to obtain that technology. Sandoval Alarcón, a key advisor of Castillo Armas and later a leader of the far right, noted, quote, the real agrarian problem of Guatemala is not the scarcity of land, but rather that lands be made to produce more. The government argued that while nearly 69% of Guatemala's arable land was planted with corn, yields were very low. Ultimately, the government's slow movement on agrarian reform, as I've said, did little to address public anxiety about growing food shortages and growing food poverty. President Castillo Armas promised liberation, but they delivered hunger and repression to the countryside. And that fostered, of course, widespread discontent. And by the time Castillo Armas was assassinated in the summer of 1957, he had already suppressed 4 major coup attempts. Now, a former government official under Jorge Ubico, and also a contender for the presidency during the revolution, General Yedegores Fuentes, returned from exile and ran for the presidency after the death of Castillo Armas. And his campaign capitalized on the sense of widespread food insecurity and food scarcity with the campaign slogan, law, literacy, bread, and health. A week before he was elected, he promised that every Guatemalan would be able to buy 1 chicken a week. Despite his populist language, privately he assured the United States that he would support private capital and strengthen the military. And indeed, a month after he was elected, Yedegores began to suppress organized labor and agricultural laborers. The general, however, followed Castillo Armas' efforts to implement a visible land reform, not effective, but visible, as a means to contain social unrest. In 1958, President Yedegores declared that the Guatemalan government urgently needed funds to buy new lands for resettlement because they had run out of public land. Unlike Decree 900, the government's land reform efforts after 1954 avoided expropriation, even though technically they could do it, and resettled campesinos on land that was already owned by the state. The Guatemalan government made a failed 1958 bid for a $95 million aid package from the United States, And when it didn't work out, Invigorating warned Eisenhower, the common enemy of communism will not invade us from the outside, but flourishes among our hungry people. Khrushchev is waiting at the door. Now, though the state lacked the financial means and political willpower to use Decree 559 to compel landowners to surrender underutilized land, they repeatedly touted the success of their agrarian development zones. The Guatemalan government used the distribution of land in these zones as a moment of political theater, a public demonstration of their commitment to campesinos, and an opportunity to reform recipients. Their goal was not simply to increase food production, but rather create ideal citizens by removing them from the influence of the masses. As the major periodical El Imparcial noted, the agrarian development zones were each loosely governed by civic corps that exercised, quote, a gentle teaching over the recipients of land, encouraging them to become good citizens. The DGAA, which is responsible for stripping land, justified its rural development plan as an opportunity to transform the exploited campesino, crippled by an absence of initiative and indifference and fatalism. They argued that campesinos who received land through Decree 559 were transformed into productive citizens and, quote, authentic human beings. A 1959 development loan fund application submitted by the Guatemalan government to the US followed an ideal family, a couple with 5 children, as they established a farm at Nueva Concepcion, which is sort of the flagship of these agrarian development zones. This large swath of land in Tiquisate had once belonged to the United Fruit Company, but it became an international showcase for the Guatemalan government's use of agrarian development to quell political discontent under Castillo Armas and then Yedigoras Fuentes. Now, of course, the name Nueva Concepcion referred directly to the Liberación government's efforts to create a new model of agrarian reform, which leveraged private property to transform rustic campesinos into modern farmers. And the Development Loan Fund application argued that as they cleared raw jungle and established a modern farm, this family of impoverished campesinos became progress-minded farmers who embraced mechanization and the market. And this powerful narrative was supported by a carefully planned crop rotation that began with campesinos planting campesino fare, corn, plantains, and beans, and ended with them having a diversified farm of 50 acres with livestock, tobacco, sesame, and rice. They also noted in this application that the government had to set rigid qualifications because previous initiatives recruited settlers based on political necessity. And they concluded that disregard for, quote, the applicant's farm background and other essential qualifications has seriously impaired successful colonization in many cases. So this was a 1959 application, and it was referring to earlier efforts in 1956 to settle the plantation that had gone awry. Because the early struggle to establish Nueva Concepcion was featured in newspapers that ran large spreads extolling the virtue of the new colony and the patriotism of its settlers. Personal interviews reiterated the transformation of campesinos into small farmers with savings, homes, and modernized farms. And early challenges like sanitation, electricity issues were downplayed or not mentioned at all. Local officials did, however, mention the sinister threat posed by the rural poor, euphemistically described as, quote, the floating population, people that approach the agrarian development zone without having passed any selection requirements. The importance of agrarian colonies as symbols of progress and prosperity encouraged the liberation government to regulate membership in the colony and patrol their borders, preventing free entry. For newly settled campesinos, this restriction on freedom and movement and association was unexpected and unwelcome. Shortly after campesinos received land in Nueva Concepcion, they began to complain that the parcels meant to liberate them from want instead served as de facto prison cells. A Prensa Libre article in February 1958 reported that a, quote, prison regime existed in Nueva Concepcion. 2 rivers, the Coyalate and the Madre Vieja, and the Pacific Ocean marked the boundaries of the new agrarian development zone. A barbed wire fence enclosed the remaining border with a single gate watched by a guard with police powers. Residents complained that they were prohibited from selling timber that they felled while readying their land for planting. And lumber was an important supplementary source of income for campesinos, who often waited months before they received agrarian credits from the government. The National Agrarian Bank made loans conditional on visual inspection, but delays meant that many campesinos could see their fields grow to near maturity before they got any money from the government, if they got any money at all. So campesinos urged the government to remove the gates and allow them free passage because, quote, they were given parcels and property and they continue to be free citizens, basically repeating back the language of Decree 559. Decree 559 proponents emphasized that beneficiaries were landowners, not renters, which was a key distinction from Decree 900 that had encouraged Bussefront. However, the debts campesinos incurred to buy lands at market value from the state or private landowners after 1954 limited both their freedom of movement and their ability to express political dissent. The agrarian development zones created by Decree 559 were promoted through high-profile tours and stories of personal salvation. And one particular story stands out, the story of Catalino Arredondo Mayen, a landless laborer and his small family who received 20 manzanas of land close to Puerto San Jose, the Pacific coast. Though the piece was meant to highlight the benefits of agrarian development zones, read closely, it also exposed fractures in the government's development scheme. Arredondo Mayen borrowed nearly 1,000 quetzales to purchase his new land from the state and acquire the materials he needed to work the land. After several years of working hard, he had reduced his outstanding debt by half, but his personal diligence didn't protect him from distressing crop losses caused by forces entirely outside of his control. He told the reporter, quote, "I try to pay punctually. Although at times our crops go badly, like it happened to me who lost a crop of sesame, and they said it was because of powder pesticide applied with an airplane in a cotton plantation that is nearby." This offhand comment exposed the untenable contradiction at the heart of the Liberación government's agrarian development strategy. Fostering a diverse web of small and medium-scale farms was not truly viable so long as export agriculture was allowed to grow with minimal regulation. The latter's insatiable hunger for land and labor and capital slowly enclosed and encircled the colonias, limiting their expansion and threatening residents and the local environment with pesticides. The continuing dominance of agro-exports on the Pacific coast ensured that these development zones remained spaces for propaganda instead of spaces for social change. And now very quickly, if you'll allow me. Or I can just stop right there.
Just conclude.
Okay. The Guatemalan elites were largely unfazed by the complaints of campesinos, and they embraced the transformational promise of places like Nueva Concepcion. The director of the GGAA and the future president, Enrique Peralta Azurdia, toured agrarian development zones throughout the Pacific coast, and he lauded the hard-working campesinos he met as the backbone for Guatemala's agrarian prosperity. He reminded them that they had complete political freedom, and their only obligation was to work for the state and produce food on their new land. So effectively, they didn't have complete freedom. The campesinos who received parcels from the DGA were praised as the architects of secure bread for our grandchildren. And Peralta Azurdia lauded the beneficiaries of Decree 559 as humble folk rooted to the earth. He encountered men upright like trees, wrote the GGAA, subject to the earth by roots of love and sacrifice, surely and with such adherence as if to challenge the storms. The article described Peralta Azurdia's tour, emphasizing the primordial connection between campesinos and the tree, both bound to the land and growing roots, familial and literal, that bound them to the soil. The DGAA cautioned that severing the timeless connection between campesinos and the land invited social and economic instability, an allusion to the 1952 agrarian reform and the social unrest that followed. And the periodical Tierra wrote, quote, "When the country interrupts the multi-millennial alliance of peasant and land, we are at the mercy of any eventuality. Man anchors himself then to the land as if it was an anchor of sweat and blood." And the government argued that devout and hardworking campesinos who benefited from Decree 559 were the best weapon against communist preaching and agitation. So the Guatemalan state used these colonias as reformatory spaces where loyal, productive, and modern citizens could be created from humble campesinos. And as they transformed the wild Pacific coast into a space of industry, The state hoped to inculcate them with civic virtues that they deemed essential for Guatemala's future prosperity, all the while masking the systemic inequalities and the growing hunger in the countryside. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the three presentations. So I'm going to give some brief comments and then we'll open up for discussion. We have 25 minutes so for this. So I think that the three papers work very well together in a sense that they are calling, in a way they are engaged in this reinterpretation of the Guatemalan Revolution. For many years the Guatemalan Revolution was kind of obscured by the Cuban Revolution because of the significance, regional significance of the Cuban Revolution, and for what Jim mentioned also, the fact that many consider that the Guatemalan Revolution had been kind of limited in effect, it had not reached to the countryside. The urban middle class component had preempted in a way an effective response to the challenges of the local elites, the Catholic Church, and the United States. Right? So that was kind of a general interpretation. The three papers, in a way, they engage in, they call us to review those kind of conceptions. Beginning with the Jim's paper, I think that the paper, I think it's a good idea to begin with this idea of revolution with the two meanings, right? Not only looking forward, but the original meaning of looking to the past. Because what is clear in the paper that I read and that he facilitated to me is that, as he said, the peasants were not only looking forward with new ideologies, but they were also a component of return to a past, right, of greater equity and justice, as you pointed out. And I think that the presentation really resituated in a way the role of peasants, against the idea of the insufficiency of the Guatemalan land reforms, ideas that it was limited or that the peasants were passive. Mayans and peasant Mayans and otherwise were at the core of the revolution, according to Jim. Therefore, the revolution was not only led by urban middle classes, the military or the intellectuals, but it critically involved and was pushed by peasants themselves. So the peasants were the ones who were driving this radicalization. There are some aspects of the paper that I really found absolutely interesting. The size of the reform, again, people who talk about how limited it was. I found quite remarkable the success and the speed of the land reform once the Agrarian Reform Law was passed. By 1954, in a few months, 2 years after the reform was issued, 500,000 people out of a population of 3 million people had benefited from the land reform. These are not minor numbers. These are huge, right? This was preempted in a way by the coup and eventually by the resignation of armies and so on. And I think that the section on bureaucracy, I think that is absolutely important for many reasons, because again, the old vision was that the Guatemalan Revolution was limited to the middle classes or the cities. What we see is that the bureaucracy acted in a quite efficient manner, with the speed in a way. And it's a way to look at that interaction and kind of avoiding this idea of the dichotomy. But the state was pretty much involved and was efficient in handling in many ways the demands of the lower classes. I have a couple of other questions here in terms of, you mentioned clearly in the paper, the idea of peasants, Mayan, and otherwise. And you are very careful about that, because these point out the fragmentation of the rural classes in Guatemala, right? And my question would be, and again, you know more about this than me, of course, is to what extent, the interests, the actions, the goals of different kinds of peasants and rural workers coincide or not, during the revolution, right? Because in the land of Guatemala, you have rural workers, you have all sorts of Ladinos working on coffee plantations, banana plantations. You have Mayan peasant communities. There's a diversity, regional, in terms of ethnicity and so on. So to what extent, in a way, cultural or ethnic norms did shape organization at the local level, appeals to justice, and so on, right? So that was kind of trying to know more about that. This has to do again with the regional variations in terms of activism, as you were describing. And again, the paper, I know, it's a brief, is part of a larger project. Which areas were involved more in this kind of this mobilization of the local agrarian committees? In the narration, again, they are kind of driving the story, radicalizing the revolution beyond maybe what Arbenz wanted in many ways. And also the last point is the land reforming comparative perspective. And I think it's interesting to think about this regarding other countries like Mexico or Bolivia, where you also have large rural masses with significant population of indigenous peoples. And I was thinking about this was about Deborah Yasher's argument about different citizenship regimes, corporate and neoliberal citizenship regimes. And the argument was that during this period, 1940s up to the 1960s, in a way, mediation between the state and the indigenous people was done by indigenous groups or institutions that categorized the indigenous peoples as peasants, right? So eventually erasing the ethnic identity and replacing with an economic identity, right? So I was thinking about this, when, again, in relation to the previous point about the diversity of the Guatemalan rural population. If we go to Julie now, I think that also is a very interesting paper in many ways, because Julie traces a story going back to the issue of revolution, what changed and what stayed the same. Julie is telling us a story that began far before the Guatemalan Revolution. It began with German migration to the country in the 1860s, and how eventually these German migrants created these coffee plantations and engaged in these all sorts of sexual relations, with Quechua indigenous people, right? And these traces of continuity and the presence, and in a way, what we see is that the process of expropriation of land of the German community began certainly in the 1930s, right? In the late 1930s, early 1940s, as Ubico reversed eventually his position of support, for the German population. So by the time that we arrive at 1944, in places like Alta Verapaz, the animosity against Germans had created the background for the expropriation of land. By the time the revolution came into place and the agrarian reform law is passed, already land has been expropriated and not returned. So here we talk about a line that defies easy labels of dictatorship, democracy, dictatorship, revolution. There's a line that goes on continuities and changes that have to be taken into account. And I think that it's important, the emphasis on the affective bonds, beyond, the political, beyond the economic transformations. Julie is asking us to reconsider, the history of land expropriation in light, of all these affective bonds between German, indigenous peoples and the children, these mixed-blooded, in a way, children, from German and Quechua. And the paper is very good in terms of laying out, the conflicts that all these expropriations created. It was not only about seizing land, it's about what happened with these people who stayed there, whose fathers left, in a way, to Germany, and they were left during the revolution and afterwards. I think it's very interesting. I found really interesting the fact that the distribution of land affected mostly, as you said, after 1952, after the decree 900, affected mostly United Fruit Company and German properties. Okay, that's very interesting. And it did not really mostly own land that was owned privately by the local elites. And maybe this was the strategy of the revolutionary government to avoid confrontation with the local elites. I don't know that, but it would be much easier. I don't know if this is the case, and you have to tell me. But I can imagine Arbenz and the people in the government say, well, let's begin with UFCO, with the fruit company, which was deeply unpopular. Then the German properties were already being nationalized and transformed. So that could give a kind of cushion before going after the local elites. So giving some space to the revolution. And I don't know, but on my attention. And again, the final point is that it raises the issue of revolution and ethnicity in a different manner. Here we have an interesting comparison with the Mexican case, probably that you know, the case of the Chinese in Sonora. After the revolution, the Chinese were expelled. There was a sizable community of Chinese in Sonora, in the state of Sonora. They were very active, very prosperous, and they were literally expelled from the country. There was an anti-Chinese campaign that drew not only on all racist ideas coming from the Porfiriato, but because of the emerging ideas of mestizaje in the country. So I found really interesting these cases of revolutions that are dealing with different ethnicities. The Germans here in the case of Guatemala, the Chinese there in Mexico. And finally, Patrick, the article again focuses about this. The paper focuses in this the idea of land reform and how land reform, in a way, is interesting because it was not totally rejected after the overthrow of Arbenz. Even in a lip service way, the counter-revolutionary governments still had to address the issue of land. And they replaced, in many ways, the programs of Arbenz and the revolution by new land reforms that emphasized the individual, the family, modernization, and so on. But still they needed to talk about land reform in order to get some legitimacy, right? So I found that very interesting. Your paper focuses mostly on the programs, the implementation, and the reasons and goals of the different land reforms. My question is about the reception by peasants and farmers. You have the testimony of Catalino Redondo Mayen about how he saw that. But what was the reaction, of the local population in many ways to this? And in trying to think beyond just repression, because clearly repression is involved. After 1954, repression is a component of the counter-revolution that is going to create, the revolutionary activity in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. That's absolutely clear. But again, the comparison comes here from Bolivia. In Bolivia, the Bolivian military also created a wedge between workers and peasants with the military-peasant pact in the 1960s. So they also talked about land reform, giving some limited land reform while repressing sectors of the population. So I was thinking, okay, in terms of comparison, how would we place the Guatemalan case? Geography also came to my mind when I was reading your paper about the different land reforms and the idea of the different agricultural development zones, this experiment, this kind of prison-like areas, where, how many, and so on. But I will stop here, and then I would like to open to any other question from. Yes.
Yes, I have two naive questions. The first one is, why is Jacobo Arbenz so relevant in the history of Guatemala? Excuse me for my ignorance. And the second one is, as you said, as far as I know, Mexico, Bolivia, Peru, Guatemala, we all have large proportions of Indian population. So why don't we do some common cause, not revolution, but some common cause for negotiating against the United States or other powers, right? Even at the micro level. So if we have the same problem across the continent, why are we so separate, right? That's a very naive question in the sense that it's very qualitative.
Let's grab a couple of other questions and then we can answer.
Yes. Yeah, my name is Ira. I'm from Alta, Verapaz, and
What a perfect match.
I used to live in Caquiton. I think what is not being addressed and what is important, and I intend to address it tomorrow in a discussion on the revolution that began in 2015 in Guatemala, is the fact that there's two basic types of agriculture in the country. One, large landowning projects, the fincas, and the land disputes over expropriations and occupations. And then, on the other hand, the small-scale farming, which may be the majority of the population. And it's a totally different situation for each of those two groupings. And in fact, the revolutionary movement that's going on right now is being promoted more by the small landholding peoples and their communities and their indigenous traditions, and their needs and demands are much different than the situation with large fincas. And I just thought I'd mention that I think in the month of May in Alta Verapaz there were 40 occupations with military repercussions just in that 1 month. So the land occupations and repressions are ongoing.
Why don't we answer these and then we can get the second wave so everyone has a chance to answer. Yep.
Well, let me start with a comment. Thanks very much for your comment, and I'll work back through these. Your comment about land occupations and the dichotomy in agriculture in Guatemala. Clearly that's the case, and that's one of the arguments that Patrick addresses so well in his broader work. The difference between a very small-scale peasant agriculture that is both for self-sufficiency and for the market, and the large fincas that grow up primarily around coffee at the second half of the 19th century, have some roots before that. Patrick's got a great discussion about how after 1954, when they begin to try to sell these new agricultural decrees, Decree 559 for particularly, how that's incompatible with the idea that you're going to spread these large fincas, because these large fincas just enclose all of these and make and squeeze into this peasant agriculture. So I think that's very clear and very important, that division between the two, and the fact that less so now to a certain extent, because there's a huge population of landless people in Guatemala, but in the 1940s and 50s certainly, that these people that owned a small bit of land, that were peasant farmers, were also the labor force for fincas and large estates, and so they performed both those functions. I wanted to mention, though, this question about land occupations. I've been working in Guatemala for 40-some years, and I don't think there's been, started first there in the 1970s working. I don't think there's been a period since the 1970s that there hasn't been lots and lots of land occupations and lots of military repercussions from them. I can remember doing work around Pagajerones, landless workers, in the, I think it was the late 1980s or 1990s. And so, there's been this constant process in which landless workers or small farmers with too little land and families are constantly pushing back, trying to get land, constantly pushing back, trying to get land, constantly at the edge of the law or a little past the edge of the law, pushing back to get land. It's been the constant in Guatemala. It was constant. It was occurring before 1944. It occurs through the revolution from 44 to 54. It's what drives the revolution in some ways. And it occurs, again, constantly in the 7 decades since. So, one might want to try to take heart with constancy, but this is a constancy we don't want to see. This is just a continuing process of continual impoverishment and repression that comes from it. So I'll look very much forward to your discussion tomorrow in 2015. So, that was one question. I'll leave others to try to address other questions and then we can move back.
Sure.
Why has Jacobo been so relevant?
I don't think I have an answer for that. I mean, I think a broader discussion of the importance of the memory of 1944 to 54 in contemporary Guatemala is pertinent. I think there's a long period of really silence about the revolution, and that now in this post-peace period and with transitional justice, the land invasions and other things, and the amount of corruption, obviously the 2015 protests and more recent national strike, has made people talk about revolution again and look back to this period and recuperate this memory in a different way. And yeah.
Well, there's, if I may, there's a regional component, right? It's not only because of the revolution is being kind of recovered in the Guatemalan context, for in a more accurate way of what it was, but I think that there's a regional component too. There are many works that have come, Greg Grandin and Jill Joseph work about a century of revolution, right? That places exactly it places the Guatemalan Revolution as a critical moment in this contest between revolution and counter-revolution. We know why, in some ways, it's relevant, because 1954 is the first direct intervention of the United States under the Cold War paradigm in Latin America. It's the first major intervention sponsored by the CIA in Latin America that preceded, the intervention in Cuba. So there are many other ways, why 1954 or the revolution has been kind of recovered, resituated, and Arbenz has been come to be re-examined, because in the old ways it was like, well, he was a good-intentioned guy, but, well, it failed, and that's it, right? And the story is much more complex. As the more we explore, the Guatemalan case, the more the complexity of the revolution and his figure are coming more to the forefront, right?
I think, and also in terms of popular memory in Guatemala, I mean, you can probably tell me better, but the sense that I get there's a real sense that the revolution mattered and that there's this recuperation of that memory. In terms of the question of land invasions and small and medium-sized producers, it is so important. In land invasions, it's pretty much the constant. In the 1920s, it was highly politicized. The land invasions was, an extremely political act about demands for labor reform and land, and in particular. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my work is to show just how important the smaller agricultural production was. One of the great challenges in the pre-1944 period, though, is that the available statistics are very sketchy and imperfect, in part because they just, the state really didn't. One, on the big plantations themselves, really didn't enter until, inside of a plantation before 1930, before President Ubico's government. And so collecting statistics on corn production, for example, was very, inaccurate at best. And the same goes for land records and stuff. There was a deliberate obscuring of who owned what. And you, of course, know the consequences of all of the difficult land processes of titling and retitling and boundaries. And all of these things make it very difficult for us to say this is how much land was owned by who and what kinds of people as historians, but you can use other records to show just how important those places were. So.
I think I would encourage or I think there's a really strong connection between the plantations and the small-scale farms in the highlands and throughout the country. One example, and that's not to deny the conflict that you mentioned or the differences. Like, I've been at meetings where indigenous campesinos have been talking to laborers in the labor movement about how they organize, and they have very different and very strident debates about how they organize, right? They see themselves as having different goals, but they also understand themselves, at least in the meetings that I've been at, as having common cause at the end of the day for change in government. And the one case that stands out to me about the connections between small farms and large plantations and the struggles that occur in those two different agro-ecological zones is the case of Hector-Vez. I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's a documentary called Kilometer 207. It's basically on this stretch of highway in Retaleuqueo, which is a very landowner-dominated department on the Pacific coast, where this community, or a small group of peasants, basically occupied a stretch of land alongside the highway, which wasn't owned by the landowners, it's government land, and they protested the labor conditions on the plantation for better labor conditions. And the reason they were able to maintain the protest over several years was because they relied on familiar connections in the highlands with families that were bringing them food, and sort of some members in the protest would go back to the communities and sort of recuperate, and other members would come down. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are differences in terms of their organizing goals, but that many times campesinos working on plantations or laborers on plantations have family connections to people on the highlands or people in small farms. So the connections, I don't know if that makes any sense, but there's very strong interconnection, maybe especially in a place like Guatemala, which at the end of the day is very small. In terms to answering your questions, Jorge, I think the reception by peasants is really interesting. One of the challenges that I had, and I hope to be able to develop this more, is that after 1954, there's a sort of a silence that falls in the countryside as a part of that repression. A lot of people who did speak out were killed, or were fled to exile, or just refused to speak. So that case that I found where they were complaining about being in a prison cell, I thought was outstanding for being. It's not something I expected to find in the newspapers. And I think that the reason it was there is because they were speaking in the language of Decree 559.
Right, because I was thinking, well, why is this person in this case? I mean, he would be killed the next day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also the comment of comparing it to other land reforms and the use of land as a wedge. One of the things I didn't explore in this presentation, and even in a larger piece have not fully explored, is the way that the land was awarded to primarily Ladinos. Now, defining who Ladino is in Guatemala is a very complex and thorny question, but there was an intentional focus on a certain kind of Guatemalan that was going to be awarded land who was deemed to be a supporter of the government.
Okay, we are on time, so we can continue this. Thank you very much, and thank you much for the presenters. Okay.